Well, welcome everyone. My name is Doug Dammann, a curatorial educator at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and welcome to our reoccurring Coffee and Hardtack series. With us today is Tim Townsend, head historian and chief of interpretation at the Lincoln Home Site in Springfield, Illinois. Tim, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Good morning. Glad to be here.
Great. Tim, can you tell us about your duties and responsibilities as Chief of Interpretation and Historian at the Lincoln Home Site?
Yeah, well, it covers a variety of things. The interpretation side would be, how we're presenting the Lincoln story to visitors, the story of Lincoln and his family that lived here in the home for 17 years. What are the important stories to tell? How do we tell them? Through what media do we tell them? Is it, of course, personal services, tours of the home, but there's also exhibits in our visitor center, the film, wayside exhibits throughout the neighborhood, things like that, and exhibits inside a couple of the houses in the neighborhood. And so then how do we kind of piece all those different things together to tell a more complete story? Some of the things you'll hear on the tour we don't need to repeat on a wayside, for example, and things in the film we don't need to talk about in the house. So, and then also, coordinating or considering at least, well, what other stories are the visitors getting while they're in Springfield, visiting the old state capitol, the Lincoln Tomb, the Presidential Museum, and things like that, and what's our niche in that overall story. So there's this the storytelling part, the presenting, what it is, why, the importance of our site to visitors. But then there's also, in my responsibility, is kind of that cultural resource management component, overseeing or working with the other staff on potential archaeology projects, historic preservation projects, cultural landscape issues, things like that, as well as, from the historian side, making sure we're up to date with what's going on in the Lincoln field and other areas as well. And then, getting that information to the frontline interpreters so they can do their job.
Along those lines, as a historian, are you still finding new sources of information about the Lincolns and their time in Springfield?
Well, it's maybe not necessarily new information, although that does happen, but reinterpretation of information that we've known about, taking a fresh look from a different angle of elements of that Lincoln story. For example, one thing we hear a lot and wrestle with sometimes a lot is Mary Lincoln's story. What kind of person was she really, and how scholars over the generations have looked at Mary, interpreted Mary, or Lincoln's father, Thomas, what was that relationship like, and things like that. So while there is some new information, oftentimes what we end up doing in our line of work is looking at the same information but through the lens of current events or our generational perspective of the historic topics.
So you've seen a bit of a change in how Lincoln is interpreted during your career there. Is there any major aspect of that interpretation that you've either experienced or implemented during your career there, or something that really stands out for you?
Yeah, one thing we've been working on for quite some time is to kind of take a step back and look at the broader Lincoln story, the community, and try to stay away from looking at Lincoln in isolation, as if he wasn't impacted by his community, and even to the point where some of the initiatives we've been working on and youth initiatives and things like that would be looking at the broader Illinois story. The Lincoln home is 4 city blocks in downtown Springfield. Our period of significance is 1860. Well, if we just stayed with 4 blocks, 1860, that's a pretty narrow story. That's not good history, of course. So when we step back, even stepping back to the French introduction of slavery in the colonial era into the Illinois country, and how that impacts or the connections to the Lincoln era, and then beyond, the legacy of the Lincoln era, talking about the 1908 Springfield race riot and how that was the impetus for the formation of the NAACP in 1908, or 1909 was when it was founded the following year. Not that, unfortunately, race riots and that kind of violence was unique to Springfield, but it happened in Lincoln's hometown. So what does that mean to the Lincoln legacy, or how did the Lincoln legacy impact that? So altogether, then, that tells a more complete and I think a more relevant story if we talk about the larger community, the African-American community, the immigrant community, in setting that context for Lincoln.
Interesting. Now, as cultural resource manager, you see hundreds of thousands of visitors to the Lincoln home site in a normal year, before the COVID pandemic. What sort of challenges do those numbers present to you and your staff just to maintain the home itself?
Yeah, we're fortunate in the Lincoln home has gotten so much special care, from the time Robert donated it, Lincoln's oldest son Robert donated the home to the state of Illinois back in 1887. The state of Illinois did an excellent job of maintaining the home, including a 1950s restoration that opened the second floor. And then 1972, the Park Service began operation of the home. And so over the years, a home that was designed for a family has been reinforced with steel in places. And if there is a problem, something, some water damage or potential leaks or anything like that, because of what the place is, it gets attention pretty quickly and has over the years. And so, impact to the resource has been minimal, other than, painting and keeping an eye on things and new carpet and all those sorts of more cosmetic things, I think. And then, but really the biggest challenge is getting as many people, just the mechanics of tours inside the home to accommodate as many people as we can. So we feel, pretty good about, the overall condition of the home and our ability to maintain it.
What was the, when Robert presented the home, was it almost like a time capsule? Was it just like the Lincolns had left in 1861 to go to Washington, D.C., or had there been major interior changes to things like wallpaper and carpeting and the furnishings and paint colors and things like that?
Yeah, there were some changes, not structurally. Well, for one structural change was the Tilton family, who rented the home from the Lincolns when they moved to Washington, added a kitchen addition to the back. So that was a major structural change. But early on, there was an occupant named Osborne Oldroyd to the Lincoln home. He was renting it, and he set up a museum inside on the first floor. He was a Civil War veteran, so one of the earliest Lincoln collectors. And so people could go into the first floor and see stuff related to Lincoln. It didn't have to be, and it wasn't in many cases, related to his occupancy or the family. It could be stuff related to the presidency, the war, the assassination, curiosities and artifacts people wanted to see. Of course, in the 1880s, people didn't need to go to a historic house museum to know about wood-burning stoves and outhouses and all that kind of thing, because that's how they were still living, but they wanted to see that cool Lincoln stuff. Oldroyd accommodated that. And that's a good question. We don't know. I don't think we have a good sense of what it is he might have changed on wallpaper and carpeting, other than to know from 1861 to 1887, that's a long time to have still kept the same carpet and all those interior things. And then Oldroyd lived upstairs, so that wasn't part of what visitors saw when they were there. So then over time, the state, as we look at pictures of the house, slowly went from basically exhibit space to trying to recreate what the residence looked like with furniture and things like that. So up until the state of Illinois, in that 1950s restoration I mentioned, they restored the second floor for visitors for the first time. So 1953 was the year the last state caretaker lived upstairs, and so then it proceeded. Then the Park Service took the ball and went with it from there. But so in some cases we do have some good information on finishes, wallpaper. In other cases we don't really have any idea. So.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, your site not only includes the Lincoln House, but 12 other historic structures in the neighborhood around the Lincoln home. Can you tell us about some of those buildings, some of the people who lived in them, or who were Lincoln's neighbors?
Yeah, it's an interesting evolution of a neighborhood, as from the time the Lincolns left, the neighborhood evolved like any urban neighborhood would. And then, by the mid 1950s or thereabouts, well, even earlier than that, some people were concerned about getting a better control of the neighborhood, not so much for the neighborhood's sake, but of course for the Lincoln home. And plans were proposed and didn't happen. Even earlier plans going back to the 1920s called for creating a park here and tearing everything down except for the Lincoln home and creating a park with a reflecting pool and all those kinds of things. So the plans evolved from there. Homes contemporary to the Lincolns were lost over time, more modern buildings built in their place. And then by the late mid 1960s, or a little earlier, attitudes started to change about the importance of historic context. The historic preservation movement started to get traction, Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So people also looked at this neighborhood and said, well, maybe we ought to be preserving or talking about context for the neighborhood. The city of Springfield was way out front with historic preservation zoning ordinances to try to control. The state did what it could, but ultimately it was that partly commercialization, the creation of museums and souvenir shops, and proposal to build a hotel with a log cabin facade and things like that, that really prompted the Park Service, or prompted the community to ask the Park Service to come in and take a look at things. Another interesting thing about the neighborhood is the city, as I said, did a lot. And one of the things they coordinated was the restoration of what we now call the Rosenwald House, that's across the street and a little north of the Lincoln home. That's where Sears and Roebuck and philanthropist Julius Rosenwald lived as a young boy, and just coincidental to the Lincoln home. So there's other stories within the neighborhood. That house fortunately survived. But the challenge we have now is that when the Park Service acquired the home and then over about 8 years acquired the 4-block area, by the way, for the Civil War folks, when we recognize this name, Ed Bars was the one who did the initial resource study for the park and the initial research on the houses and the home and things like that. But Ed looked at the structures and determined which ones were post-Lincoln era and which ones were not. And as was just considered appropriate for the time, any post-Lincoln era structure was torn down. And so we now have a lot of empty lots that would have had homes on them. We have some homes that have survived, but they may be restored to a later time period. So we talk about having a neighborhood, but it's really not a Lincoln neighborhood. And the other thing that that we have as a challenge is the structures that survived aren't necessarily the most important stories that we should be talking about. They just happen to survive. For example, there's an African American that lived just down the street from Lincoln. He was, it's now within the park, Jameson Jenkins. He was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He lived there with his brother-in-law, James Blanks, and his wife, Martha Ann. They ended up advocating for African American education in Springfield, then moved to Chicago by 1860, and they were working with folks like John Jones and meeting with Frederick Douglass and doing all these kinds of amazing things, but we really don't know much about them. We're learning more and more thanks to a lot of local research and other initiatives. But because there's no structure there, it doesn't get the attention. So sometimes the cultural resource drives the research, and so we miss some things. But having said all that, what we have here is something obviously different to visitors who walk into the neighborhood. And so we still have that. But what we need to do is a better job of not trying to talk about a restored neighborhood. That'll never happen, but focusing more on the stories of the people, not only within the 4-block area, but also those who might have lived 4 blocks away that's not in the park, but played an important role. So,
going back to Lincoln and the neighborhood, was Lincoln a good neighbor? Was he the type of guy who would leave his garbage cans out at night, a couple days later? Do you get a sense from people that lived around him? What did they think of him? Just as, Abraham Lincoln, the neighbor, not Abraham Lincoln, the icon that we think of today.
Yeah. The stories, the reminiscences that we have all indicate that he was a good neighbor, although, he was also gone a lot as a circuit riding attorney. But he seemed to care about his neighbors. He would visit with people on his walk back home from work, which is just a few blocks from here. Visit with kids. Kids would tease him and play with him, and he would do the same. And so I think there was that care that you would expect from Lincoln, and didn't really. He didn't feel a lot of self-importance that he didn't have time to visit with people as he was walking by. Even when he got to the important positions, he did ultimately. But the sense of Lincoln, is just as you might guess. I think he enjoyed visiting. Maybe sometimes the frustration of Mary if he was visiting too much on the way home and missed dinner or something like that. But he was that person, I think, that you would expect.
And just one of our final questions. Are there things that you notice from your visitors, things about the home or the interpretation that surprise them? Something that the comments that you kind of hear about either the size of the home itself or the Lincoln family, or just something that you've kind of identified that this is a common thread that I've seen, and things that kind of the visitors walk away with knowing something different about Lincoln or the family based on their visit to the site.
Yeah, the most prevalent thing is people come expecting a log cabin in some cases. People think of Lincoln as that boy in southern Indiana or Kentucky, or that man in the White House or in the Washington Monument or in the Lincoln Memorial, I should say, and often don't consider that in between period of Lincoln's life, and they don't consider Lincoln's life as a successful attorney who commanded some pretty good sized fees from railroad companies towards the end of his legal career, and was doing pretty well for himself. So that would be the most obvious thing that I think people are surprised with. Then as they go into the house, and maybe it's because of the photographs of that time period when we have them are black and white, but the colors, and that's of course isn't reflective of Lincoln as much as Mary, but the bright wallpapers and carpeting and all of those things that and some of which we do have some good information as a reference back to Lincoln, but the ability to the fact that these people did not live the black and white lives as the photos might indicate. I mean, when people think about it for a minute, they realize it, but it surprises them at first, I think.
For our visitors out there, aside from making a visit down to Springfield and seeing not only your site, but also the old state capitol, and the tomb, and everything else that Springfield has to offer, can you recommend any resources as far as books or websites, podcasts, things that you've encountered that if people want to know more about Lincoln and his pre-presidential years in Springfield. Can you turn us on to anything or help us out to find some more information?
Yeah, the standard biographies are all good. David Donald, Ron White, Michael Burlingame, all those are great resources. There are more local, and if you go to the Abraham Lincoln Association website, you can pull up great resources there. Even to go to what I think it's called Lincoln Log now, we used to call it Lincoln Day by Day, where you can just click on a day in Lincoln's life. It's all online and see what he was doing and who he was talking with. You can peruse the collected works if you're so inclined. But the other thing that's being put up, even as we speak on the Abraham Lincoln Association website, are a series of articles and data and research that a local attorney, Richard Hart, has done, conducted literally over decades. That's a great insight into that community of Springfield. And it's a variety of articles that whether it's the African American community, immigrant community, he's done things like research circuses that visited Springfield, and it's just a great, among many other things, schools and teachers, and so it's just a great treasure trove, a great resource on insight into Lincoln Springfield, certainly.
Great. Well, Tim, thanks so much for your time, and also being the first coffee and hardtack program that I have gone solo with. For those of you who are viewing this, know that normally I was joined by my colleague Jen Edgington in these programs. Jen has since has moved on from the Kenosha Public Museums. She's actually going to be a local colleague of Tim's down at the Illinois State Museum. So Tim, I'm sure you'll be seeing Jen around your travels around Springfield. We wish her nothing but the best. She had a great 4.5 years here at the Kenosha Museum campus, and her impact will be felt for years to come, including with this program. So Tim, you were the first one that I have done solo. So thanks for your patience on that. And
you did great.
I appreciate it. Hope to see you here soon. We had you here for a program a number of years ago, and it's always been a goal to get you back up to do some things on Lincoln. And so we hope to have you have the ability to host on-site programming again soon. And we'd love to have you back.
Great. Anytime.
All right. Take care. Thanks so much. And for our viewers out there, look for our future coffee and hardtack. We hope to be posting these about one a month as we kind of move forward into 2021. So look for them on the Facebook site and our other programs, the Second Friday lectures, different presentations on the Facebook page as we proceed through 2021. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye.